Imagine a moment when you can no longer pretend. The masks you've worn for decades feel suddenly suffocating. The games everyone else seems to be playing become transparent. Like a stage set under harsh light, the life you've built starts to resemble a prison constructed out of other people's expectations. You're not depressed and you're not lost. You're waking up. And with that awakening comes a slow, inevitable shedding of everything that isn't truly you. Carl Jung spent his entire career documenting this process in thousands of patients and in himself. Again and again he saw a striking pattern. Genuine spiritual growth does not arrive as a flash of lightning or a grand declaration. It emerges as a gradual releasing, a slow letting go of patterns that once felt like survival, but now feel like suffocation. It's like outgrowing a childhood bedroom. You don't wake up one morning and decide to leave. You simply realize the room no longer fits. This shift begins subtly. Something in you starts rejecting what is false or outdated. It's not a conscious decision at first. It's more like an allergic reaction to inauthenticity, a kind of inner recoil that grows stronger as your spirit gets clearer. The habits, identities, and attachments that once gave you comfort begin to taste like ashes. Without warning, you find yourself unable to participate in conversations, roles, or rituals that used to define your life. This isn't rebellion, it's evolution. According to Jung, this rejection of what no longer serves you is not only inevitable, but essential. It's the foundation of transformation. Your psyche is rearranging itself from the inside out, reorienting toward your true center, what Jung called the self, the deep, authentic core beyond ego. This self doesn't need validation, recognition, or constant stimulation. It's whole already, like a deep underground spring that no longer depends on rainfall. And as you move closer to it, your old strategies for belonging and survival begin to fall away. The first thing that tends to dissolve is the desperate hunger for approval. This is not about suddenly deciding you don't care what others think. It's about a structural shift inside you that makes approval-seeking physically uncomfortable. Imagine you've eaten sugar your whole life and then, one day, your body develops an intolerance. What once felt sweet now makes you sick. Spiritually, that's what happens with approval. For years you may have shaped your words, actions, and even your appearance to please the people around you. You may have internalized their standards so deeply that you can't tell where they end and you begin. But as you grow spiritually, this dynamic starts to fracture. The compliments that once lit you up begin to feel hollow. The disapproval that once terrified you no longer lands in the same way. You discover that the more you lean into your authentic self, the less you can tolerate bending yourself into someone else's mold. Jung documented countless cases of this. A woman who had lived for her mother's approval suddenly found herself unable to perform the old dance of pleasing and placating. She wasn't angry or defiant, she was simply done. Every time she tried to repeat the old patterns, her hands would tremble, her stomach would clench, her voice would falter. Her entire system rebelled against the performance. A man who had built his identity around professional recognition found himself strangely indifferent to promotions and titles, not from burnout, but from evolution. At first, this change feels awkward, even frightening. You stop posting for likes but still check your phone. You stop fishing for compliments but still notice their absence. You're between worlds, no longer addicted to approval, but not yet comfortable without it. This in-between space can feel disorienting, like being suspended between trapezes, but it's also the space of real growth. As the hunger for approval dies, something else is born, an unshakable sense of inner worth. Not confidence, which still depends on comparison, but worth that references only itself. You stop needing others to validate your existence because you finally feel your existence from within. This is why highly spiritual people often seem mysteriously self-assured. They're not trying to project confidence. They've simply stopped the exhausting game of earning their right to exist through others' approval. Jung called this inner authority a compass that points true, regardless of external opinions. This compass doesn't always make life easier. Sometimes it pushes you into conflict with long-standing relationships, jobs, or family expectations, but it also frees you. Once you begin living from this inner authority, your energy is no longer scattered across dozens of performances. You become available to your own life in a way you never were before. The second thing that tends to dissolve is the need to be special. This one often shocks people because it feels counterintuitive. Isn't spiritual awakening about discovering your uniqueness? Yes, but there's a profound difference between knowing your uniqueness and needing to be special. Jung observed that as people develop spiritually, they undergo what looks like a paradox. They become more themselves while caring less about how that self is perceived. They become more unique while needing less recognition for it. They become extraordinary by relinquishing the need to be seen as extraordinary. Early on, however, there is almost always a phase Jung called spiritual inflation. People have a genuine awakening experience and suddenly feel chosen, superior, or untouchable. They've glimpsed truths others haven't. They've touched dimensions others can't. They've read books and practiced techniques that set them apart. And for a while, this feeling of specialness can seem like spiritual achievement. You might find yourself subtly or not so subtly signaling your status, dropping hints about your meditation practice, mentioning your synchronicities, framing your insights in ways that highlight your advanced state of consciousness. You're not necessarily bragging, but you're differentiating yourself from the unconscious masses. Then, without warning, something shifts. The very act of showcasing your specialness begins to feel heavy, exhausting, even embarrassing. A man Jung worked with had built his entire identity around being spiritually advanced. Friends came to him for wisdom. He meditated longer, fasted harder, read more esoteric texts. And then one day, mid-sentence, he simply stopped. He later described the moment. I suddenly saw myself from outside and I looked ridiculous. I was using spirituality to be special, which is the opposite of spiritual. This recognition begins the slow quit. You start catching yourself about to share a spiritual experience for the hit of specialness, about to drop hints about your consciousness level, about to position yourself as more awakened than others. And each time you catch yourself, it becomes harder to continue. The quitting process manifests in subtle ways. You stop mentioning your spiritual practices unless directly asked. You lose interest in comparing consciousness levels. You quit needing others to know about your insights. You become comfortable being seen as ordinary. You stop using spiritual language to elevate yourself. One woman described her transition. I used to need everyone to know I was different, deeper, more conscious. Now I'm happy to be invisible. Being special was a prison. Being nobody is freedom. And here's the paradox Jung found so fascinating. As people quit needing to be special, they become truly unique. Not performatively unique, but authentically unique. When you stop trying to stand out, your genuine nature naturally distinguishes itself. When you quit performing your specialness, your actual special qualities emerge. Jung called this individuation without inflation. You become completely yourself without needing anyone to notice. You're like a flower that blooms whether anyone's watching or not. The blooming is for the blooming, not for the watching. This shift terrifies the ego, which has often built its entire structure on being special. If I'm not special, the ego asks, then what am I? The answer, which takes time to fully accept, is simple. You are you. That's enough. That's everything. The third thing that tends to dissolve is the performance of happiness. Not happiness itself, but the performance of it. In our culture, and especially in spiritual circles, there's enormous pressure to appear perpetually positive, enlightened beyond suffering, radiating love and light at all times. You're supposed to be above negative emotions, beyond petty concerns, untouched by the messiness of human life. But Jung discovered that this performance of happiness is actually anti-spiritual. It's another mask, just with a spiritual face. Genuine spiritual development doesn't make people perpetually happy. It makes them perpetually real. And reality includes the full spectrum of human experience. Joy and sorrow, peace and turmoil, light and shadow. As people develop genuine spiritual depth, they slowly quit this exhausting performance. They stop pretending everything is fine when it isn't. They stop forcing smiles when they're grieving. They stop spouting positive affirmations when they're genuinely struggling. They quit the spiritual bypass and embrace the spiritual embodiment. A therapist Jung supervised went through this transition dramatically. She had built her practice on being the enlightened healer, always centered, always peaceful, always radiating wisdom. Then her son died, and she couldn't perform anymore. She tried to return to work with her spiritual persona intact, but her body wouldn't let her. She'd sit with clients, trying to be the wise healer, and tears would just start falling. She told Jung, "I thought being spiritual meant transcending human pain. Now I realize it means embracing it. I can't be the enlightened one anymore. I can only be the real one." This marks the turning point from performance to authenticity. When you quit the performance of happiness, you don't become gloomy or negative. You become honest. You reclaim the full spectrum of your being. And in that honesty, a different kind of light emerges. Not the brittle glow of forced positivity, but the steady warmth of genuine presence. As the performance of happiness fades, something remarkable begins to take its place. Authenticity. When you stop trying to appear enlightened, you can finally live from the truth of your experience. You start noticing the subtle textures of your inner world. Grief and joy, rage and tenderness, confusion and clarity, without trying to categorize them as good or bad. Life becomes less about curating an image and more about inhabiting your own reality. This shift can feel disorienting at first. If you've spent years projecting an image of calm or positivity, people around you may react with surprise or even disappointment when you drop the mask. You may lose some friendships or professional connections that depended on your old persona. Yet you also discover a deeper intimacy with the people who remain. When you let go of the performance, you give others permission to do the same. They start sharing their own unpolished truths. You begin building relationships grounded in mutual honesty rather than mutual pretending. The fourth thing that begins to dissolve is the need for certainty. This is perhaps one of the most destabilizing shifts in the entire spiritual journey. Most of us are taught from childhood that knowledge equals safety. We cling to facts, doctrines, and explanations to orient ourselves in an unpredictable world. We craft beliefs about who we are, how life works, and what happens after death. These certainties become the scaffolding of our identity. Jung noticed that as spiritual depth develops, these scaffolds begin to shake. Not because they're proven wrong, but because you realize the need for certainty itself is a form of imprisonment. Truth is not a fixed possession you can hold. It's a living reality you can participate in. The moment you grip it, it turns into dogma. One of Jung's most brilliant patients was a physicist who entered therapy in a state of crisis. His scientific training had given him confidence in predictable laws and measurable realities. But his spiritual awakening shattered his sense of order. "I used to know how the universe worked," he told Jung. "Now, I realize I don't even know how my coffee cup works. The more conscious I become, the less certain I am about anything." At first, this loss of certainty felt like confusion, even madness. But gradually it revealed itself as clarity. A clarity born of humility and wonder. He saw past the illusion of knowledge into the reality of mystery. His mind still tried to rebuild certainty by replacing old scientific facts with new spiritual facts. But every time he tried to crystallize a spiritual truth, it would dissolve. Jung watched him slowly quit the need for solid ground. This quitting of certainty tends to unfold in stages. First, you release your grip on the external world. You stop needing absolute answers about how reality works. Then you loosen your assumptions about other people's motivations. Next, you begin to question your own story about the past, recognizing how much of it is interpretation rather than objective fact. Finally, you release your certainty about your own identity. Each stage of release brings both terror and liberation. The ego experiences it as death, the death of the know-it-all. Mind that kept you safe but small. Yet on the other side of this death lies a new capacity, the ability to hold paradox. You can believe contradictory things simultaneously without needing to resolve them. You can act decisively while admitting you might be wrong. You can commit to a path while remaining open to mystery. A woman described her process this way. I used to have strong opinions about everything: politics, spirituality, relationships, purpose. Now when someone asks what I believe, I honestly don't know. Not from confusion, but from openness. Every certainty I release creates space for something more beautiful than answers. Presence with what is. This is what Jung considered a hallmark of spiritual maturity. The recognition that reality is larger than any mental model can contain. You quit certainty not because nothing is true, but because truth is too alive to be caged in concepts. The fifth thing that begins to dissolve is blame. Not just blaming others, but the entire victim-perpetrator narrative your ego uses to make sense of suffering. Blame feels satisfying because it provides a storyline. It explains why you're hurt. It preserves your innocence. It gives you an identity and even a community of fellow sufferers. But over time, blame becomes a cage. Jung observed that as people develop spiritually, they undergo a radical shift in how they relate to their wounds. They stop seeing themselves as victims of others' actions and start seeing themselves as participants in larger patterns. This doesn't mean excusing harm or bypassing trauma. It means reclaiming power. A woman came to Jung filled with legitimate grievances: an abusive childhood, a betraying ex-husband, discriminating employers. Her anger was justified, her blame accurate, but it was also killing her. She was so identified with being wronged that she couldn't move forward. Through years of work, Jung watched her slowly quit blame. She didn't do it by denying what happened or forgiving prematurely, but by recognizing her own participation in patterns. She saw how she unconsciously chose partners who would betray her, jobs that would discriminate, situations that would confirm her victim identity. She told Jung, "The day I stopped blaming was the day I became free. Not because others weren't wrong, they were, but because I finally saw that holding on to blame was my choice. I was using their wrongness to avoid my own responsibility for my life." This shift is excruciating for the ego. It means taking responsibility for things that genuinely weren't your fault. It means seeing how you unconsciously participated in your own wounding. It means admitting that on some level you needed the very experiences you've spent years blaming others for. Yet it also marks the beginning of profound empowerment. Jung documented the stages of quitting blame. First comes rage at the unfairness. This shouldn't have happened. Then recognition of patterns. This keeps happening. Next comes seeing unconscious participation. I somehow contribute to this. After that comes radical responsibility. I am the author of my experience. Finally, comes transcending the victim-perpetrator paradigm altogether. We are all playing roles in each other's awakening. A man who had spent decades blaming his father for his struggles went through this process. He said, "I realized I had made my father into a monster to avoid seeing my own shadows. The day I quit blaming him, I saw him clearly for the first time, just another wounded human doing his best with his own trauma. And I saw myself clearly too, not a victim, but a soul who chose this exact father for my own evolution." This doesn't mean accepting abuse or staying in harmful situations. It means recognizing that even your wounds can serve your awakening. Jung observed that people who quit blame don't become doormats. They become powerful. They stop giving others the power to define their story. When you quit seeking approval, you begin to feel your own worth. When you quit needing to be special, you discover your authentic uniqueness. When you quit performing happiness, you open to genuine presence. When you quit needing certainty, you step into mystery. And when you quit blame, you reclaim your power. Each letting go reveals a deeper layer of your own being, a capacity that had been hidden beneath the old patterns. This process is slow because it's not just behavioral change. It's a death and rebirth of identity. You're not just quitting habits, you're quitting who you thought you were. And that takes time, courage, and enormous compassion for yourself. Jung noted that people often oscillate during this phase. You quit and return, release and grip again, let go and grab back. This isn't failure. It's the spiral nature of growth. Each time you return to an old pattern, you're a little less attached. Each time you grip again, your grip is a little looser. There's an unmistakable moment when this slow process starts to turn into embodiment. You no longer see these quits as sacrifices, but as inevitabilities. The person you were is fading. The person you're becoming is emerging. Your nervous system adjusts to new patterns. Your relationships shift to match your new vibration. People who resonated with your old identity may drift away, while others who share your new alignment appear almost magnetically. And through it all, you begin to sense that you're not alone. All over the world, other people are waking up and slowly quitting the same things. You're part of a quiet revolution of souls, discovering that spiritual growth isn't about adding more, but about releasing what was never true. As blame fades and responsibility takes its place, a deeper shift begins to unfold. You start to feel a quiet strength rising from within, a kind of groundedness that doesn't depend on others' behavior or the circumstances of your life. You realize you've been living with an invisible tether, an attachment to the narrative of who hurt you, who failed you, who owes you something. When that tether dissolves, you experience a startling sense of freedom. You're no longer defined by what happened to you. You're defined by who you're becoming. It's at this point that many people encounter the sixth pattern. Jung described spiritual bypassing. This is subtler than the previous patterns because it can look, on the surface, like spiritual progress. In reality, it's a way of using spirituality to avoid being fully human. Spiritual bypassing can take many forms. Meditation used to escape painful emotions, instead of integrating them. Everything happens for a reason, used to dismiss grief instead of feeling it. We're all one used to avoid boundaries instead of setting them. Ego death used as a strategy to sidestep psychological healing instead of doing it. Jung noticed that people often begin their spiritual journey by building an idealized self-image, a persona of the peaceful, enlightened seeker, and then use spiritual concepts to reinforce it. At first, bypassing feels like progress. You're calmer. You're less reactive. You can distance yourself from painful emotions. But over time, this distance turns into disconnection. Your relationships feel flat. Your body feels numb. You're technically spiritual, but you're also strangely absent from your own life. A Buddhist practitioner came to Jung after 20 years of deep meditation. He'd achieved remarkable states of consciousness, experienced profound emptiness, and touched the void. But his relationships were disasters. His emotions were numbed. His life was dissociated. He had used enlightenment as a way to bypass his humanity. Jung watched him slowly quit this bypass. It was more painful than his original awakening. He had to come back down into his body, into his feelings, into his very human needs and desires. After touching the infinite, he had to learn to be finite again. After experiencing no self, he had to rebuild a healthy self. The man described it this way: I thought spirituality was about transcending human experience. Now I realize it's about finally having human experience. I spent 20 years trying to be nobody. Now I'm learning to be somebody, this particular somebody, with this particular life, these particular wounds and gifts. Quitting spiritual bypassing looks like admitting you have preferences, despite accepting what is. Feeling anger, even though you understand everyone is doing their best. Wanting intimacy, even while knowing you're already one with all beings. Having boundaries, even as you see all as self. Experiencing fear, even while trusting the universe. This creates what Jung called spiritual maturity. The ability to be fully human and fully spiritual simultaneously. Not using one to escape the other, but living at the intersection where heaven meets earth. You're no longer trying to get out of life. You're learning how to be here, deeply, completely, vulnerably. As this integration deepens, your spirituality begins to feel less like an escape and more like an anchor. Meditation stops being a retreat from life and starts being a way to meet life more fully. Practices you once used to transcend your emotions now help you digest them. Teachings you once used to detach from relationships now help you deepen them. This shift can feel awkward at first. After years of seeking transcendence, embodiment may feel dense, messy, or even regressive. But gradually you realize it's the opposite of regression. It's completion. You're no longer splitting your spiritual life from your human life. You're allowing them to merge. And with this merging comes the seventh pattern. Jung described the end of isolation. Many people, especially in the early stages of awakening, believe that spiritual growth means separating from others. You're seeing through illusions others still believe. You're feeling things others can't feel. You're knowing things others don't know. How could you possibly connect with people who are asleep? At first, isolation feels noble, even necessary. You withdraw from relationships and social circles that feel shallow or unconscious. You spend more time alone. You may even move away from old communities or careers. This period of solitude is often essential. It gives your psyche the space to reorganize. But Jung noticed that genuine spiritual maturity always leads back to connection, though of a completely different quality. Not the unconscious merging of the asleep, but the conscious meeting of the awake. As you quit the subtle arrogance of being more conscious, as you release the identity of being the awakened one among the sleeping, the walls you've built between yourself and others begin to soften. A woman who had spent years in spiritual solitude told Jung, "I thought I was alone because I was too conscious for others. Then I realized I was alone because I was afraid. Afraid of being seen in my humanity, my struggles, my very non-enlightened moments. My spiritual isolation was actually spiritual pride." When she began to let go of that pride, something beautiful happened. She found she could connect with anyone. Not by lowering her consciousness, but by embracing her humanity. She could be with unconscious people without judgment because she recognized her own unconscious patterns. She could love asleep people because she remembered her own sleep. Jung documented that genuine spiritual maturity leads to what he called conscious relationship, the ability to connect without merging, to love without attachment, to be intimate without losing self, to share truth without preaching. You don't have to dim your light to be with others, but you also don't have to use your light to prove superiority. The quitting of isolation doesn't mean returning to unconscious social patterns. It means finding those rare others who are also quitting. Quitting approval seeking, quitting specialness, quitting performance, quitting certainty, quitting blame, quitting bypassing. And with these people creating something new. Conscious community. This is one of the most powerful revelations of the spiritual path. Awakening doesn't separate you from humanity. It deepens your belonging to it. You begin to sense an invisible network of people waking up across the globe. People who have never met but are walking parallel paths. You recognize them by their honesty, their humility, their unwillingness to play the old games. At this stage, your relationships take on a new flavor. Conversations become less about convincing and more about sharing. Boundaries become clearer but also kinder. You're no longer looking for people to complete you or validate you. You're looking for people with whom you can be fully yourself. Nothing added, nothing hidden. Ironically, it's in this phase of deeper connection that many people finally discover what they were seeking all along. A sense of home. Not a home built on approval, specialness, or certainty, but a home built on authenticity, presence, and shared humanity. As you move through these stages, you begin to see the pattern that links them all. Each thing you quit creates space for something more authentic to emerge. When you quit seeking approval, inner worth emerges. When you quit needing to be special, true uniqueness emerges. When you quit performing happiness, genuine joy emerges. When you quit needing certainty, wisdom emerges. When you quit blame, power emerges. When you quit bypassing, embodiment emerges. And when you quit isolation, real connection emerges. You start to realize that spiritual growth is less about acquiring something and more about removing what blocks the flow of your own aliveness. It's like clearing debris from a stream. The water was always there. The current was always strong. You're simply allowing it to move freely again. This process isn't linear or tidy. You'll find yourself circling back to old habits, revisiting old patterns. You'll catch yourself seeking approval or performing happiness or slipping into spiritual bypassing. This doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're human. Growth happens in spirals, not straight lines. Each return to an old pattern is an invitation to release it more deeply. Over time, these releases accumulate. Your inner landscape changes. You become less reactive, more grounded, more spacious. You begin to trust the process itself. You stop demanding that your awakening look a certain way or happen on a certain timetable. You stop comparing your journey to anyone else's. And perhaps most profoundly, you start to feel a quiet companionship with life itself. You sense that something larger than your ego is guiding this entire process. You no longer need to force it. You can allow it. You can participate in it with curiosity and compassion. This is the soil in which true spiritual maturity grows, not the brittle perfection of a flawless persona, but the rich, dark earth of a fully inhabited life. Here, spirituality is no longer an escape or an identity. It's simply the way you live, moment to moment, breath by breath. As the seventh pattern of isolation fades, something subtler begins to dawn. You no longer experience spirituality as something you do. It becomes what you are. The endless striving to improve, transcend, or purify yourself starts to lose its grip. You discover that underneath every quit, there is an even deeper letting go, the surrender of control itself. This eighth stage isn't about quitting a single behavior. It's about quitting the project of self-improvement as the organizing principle of your life. You stop trying to become enlightened. You stop measuring your progress. You stop comparing yourself to teachers, peers, or past versions of yourself. You realize that all the striving was built on the assumption that you were somehow broken or incomplete. A man who had spent decades in therapy, retreats, and self-help programs described this moment. I finally saw that my whole identity was wrapped around trying to fix myself. Even my spirituality had become another form of self-attack. The day I quit trying to improve myself was the day I felt whole for the first time. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections. All the qualities you've been chasing out in the world, wisdom, love, courage, clarity, you begin to find within. You no longer need a teacher to mirror them, a lover to bestow them, a guru to approve them. You become your own source, not in the narcissistic sense, but in the humble sense of seeing that what you were seeking was always already here. This is also the stage where paradox becomes your native language. You can see yourself as both human and divine, broken and whole, evolving and complete. You can love the path without needing to finish it. You can practice without needing to arrive. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you free. The ninth pattern that dissolves naturally from this freedom is the compulsion to find your purpose. Many people approach spirituality as a way to discover their one true calling, the career, mission, or destiny that will finally make their life meaningful. For years they search for signs, analyze their talents, compare themselves to others. They treat purpose as a single puzzle to solve. Jung observed that as spiritual maturity deepens, purpose stops being a problem. Not because you've solved it, but because you've outgrown the question. You realize life is not a riddle with a hidden answer, but an unfolding with infinite expressions. You don't have to find your purpose. You get to live purposefully. This shift is subtle but profound. Instead of asking, "What am I meant to do?" you start asking, "What is alive for me now?" Instead of waiting for a grand mission to appear, you begin embodying your values in small, immediate ways. Your sense of purpose becomes less like a map and more like a pulse. An inner rhythm you can feel moment by moment. A woman who left a high-paying job to find her purpose told Jung, "I thought I'd find a new career or mission. Instead, I found a new way of being. I discovered my purpose isn't a single act, but a way of showing up with presence, compassion, and integrity in whatever I'm doing." Paradoxically, This surrender to not knowing often leads to the very clarity people were seeking all along. When you stop demanding that life reveal its plan, life begins to move through you with ease. You're guided not by goals but by resonance. You follow the thread of aliveness. And as you do, work, relationships, and opportunities begin to align organically. The 10th pattern that dissolves, and perhaps the most liberating of all, is the illusion of separation. This is not an intellectual belief but a felt reality that emerges slowly as the previous layers fall away. You've already glimpsed it in meditation or mystical states, but now it starts showing up in everyday life. The stranger on the street doesn't feel entirely separate. The tree outside your window feels like a cousin. Even your own inner parts, your critic, your wounded child, your protector, feel less like enemies and more like aspects of one organism. This doesn't mean you lose your individuality. It means your individuality becomes transparent to something larger. You can still say I while also sensing the vast we that includes all beings. You can still have boundaries while also feeling interconnected. You can still act on your own behalf while also sensing you're acting on behalf of the whole. Jung believed this recognition of unity was the ultimate fruit of individuation. Not merging into a faceless oneness, but becoming so fully yourself that you naturally participate in the whole. The drop becomes ocean without ceasing to be a drop. A teacher once put it this way: before awakening, I thought I was in the world. After awakening, I see the world is in me. This stage brings an extraordinary sense of intimacy with life. Simple acts, washing dishes, walking outside, greeting a friend, vibrate with aliveness. Suffering doesn't disappear, but it's held differently. Pain is no longer proof of isolation but an expression of interconnectedness. Even death loses some of its sting because you sense it's not an ending but a transformation of form. At this point, you're no longer quitting patterns as much as you're being lived by something deeper. The river of life moves through you, and you don't need to control its direction. This doesn't make you passive or apathetic. It makes you available. Available to respond to what's here, to serve where needed, to create without clinging to outcomes. You may notice a quiet humility arising. The more deeply you awaken, the less special you feel. Not in a diminished sense, but in a liberating sense. You're no longer the star of your own movie. You're a participant in a vast unfolding. And yet, paradoxically, you also feel more precious than ever. Not because you're above anyone else, but because you're an unrepeatable expression of the whole. People at this stage often speak of ordinary freedom or everyday enlightenment. It's not dramatic. It doesn't look like the peak experiences that once defined your path. It looks like being fully here, fully human, quietly awake. You may still meditate, pray, or do rituals, but not as requirements. They're simply ways of tending the garden of your life. Jung emphasized that none of this makes you immune to human struggles. You'll still grieve, get angry, make mistakes, face uncertainty, but you'll hold it all in a larger space. You'll stop identifying with the storm and start identifying with the sky. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to live your awakening rather than talk about it. You embody it in your kindness, your choices, your relationships, your work. You no longer need to convince anyone of anything. You no longer need to brand yourself as spiritual. You've quietly quit the last illusion that awakening makes you different from the rest of humanity. In the end, Jung's observations point to a single paradoxical truth. The more you awaken, the more ordinary you become. Not ordinary in the sense of dull or limited, but ordinary in the sense of fully human. Nothing to prove, nothing to defend. This ordinariness is the greatest freedom because it allows life to move through you without obstruction. If there's a thread running through all these quits, it's this. Every layer you release brings you closer to what you've always been. Approval seeking falls away and you find inner worth. Specialness falls away and you find uniqueness. Performing happiness falls away and you find real joy. Certainty falls away and you find mystery. Blame falls away and you find power. Bypassing falls away and you find embodiment. Isolation falls away and you find connection. Self-improvement falls away, and you find wholeness. The search for purpose falls away, and you find presence. Separation falls away, and you find unity. The path is not about becoming something. It's about unbecoming everything that obscures your natural state. This final stage is not an ending, but an opening. Life continues. Growth continues. But the struggle to get somewhere else dissolves. You're no longer trying to arrive. You're already home. And in that homecoming, you may look back on all the years of seeking, striving, quitting, and returning, and feel a deep gratitude. Every step, every misstep, every illusion was part of the unfolding. Nothing was wasted. Even your mistakes were grace in disguise. This is the quiet revolution Jung foresaw. Not a world filled with perfected saints, but a world filled with ordinary people who've quit the old games and come home to themselves. People who don't need to appear spiritual because they're living spirituality in real time. People who meet life as it is, with open eyes, open hearts, and open hands. And perhaps this is the most radical discovery of all. You don't awaken out of the world. You awaken into it. You don't transcend your humanity. You inhabit it. You don't escape the mess of life. You find the sacred right in the middle of it. This is the invitation of quitting. Not to lose yourself, but to find what was always here, waiting beneath the noise, the striving, the performance, to discover at last the simple, spacious, unshakable presence of being alive. If you found this video helpful, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss our next upload.